We talked yesterday about converter function a little bit, especially for the purpose of testing, that we need to make sure our O2 sensors work or our converter won't work. And then we looked at the ways that manufacturers use to run the Cali converter monitor, which is either switch ratio testing to infer oxygen storage of the cerium, or direct testing using oxygen storage capacity directly to measure the cerium inside the converter, because we know cerium is the material that melts at the lowest temperature. So it's kind of like the fuse inside our converter. If a converter has a problem, it's the element that goes away first. So today we're going to talk about us performing an OSC test. So we talked yesterday about using switch ratio testing, where I can look at my scan tool data or lab scope and compare the switch rate of my front sensor from Richlane to the switch rate of my rear sensor from Richlane. And by comparing those, if they're over 70% or 70% or higher, then I know I have a degraded converter, something's not happening correctly. However, we also saw that a converter that's cooled off, or a bad front sensor, or other issues like that can actually cause excessive activity on the rear sensor. And because of that, most of the false catalytic converter codes we get are on vehicles that use switch rate sensing. OSC testing is more precise. That doesn't mean we can't have a false 420 code or 430 code. We can. And I mentioned how a reverse exhaust leak can cause a rear sensor to stay low, setting a code. And actually, so it's any leak between the front and rear O2 sensor. And I've seen this on Nissan, I've seen this on Toyota, I've seen this on quite a few manufacturers. And sometimes the exhaust leak is so slight, it's taken me over a half hour with a smoke machine to find it. It's that slight, but that's what's causing the code. So sometimes you really have to just go, wait a minute, I prove the converter has stuff in it, but yet I'm getting the code and my rear sensor stays low too much. The only thing that makes sense is an exhaust leak. So I really need to test and find that, and not just go, I don't hear anything. Hopefully at this point you understand that not hearing an exhaust leak doesn't mean we don't have an exhaust leak. So as we go into OSC testing, I'm going to walk through how we do that with using a combination of propane and a scan tool in order to do an OSC test. And I use this same test a lot of times to range my O2 sensors. Can everybody see Rich? Can everyone see Lean? So if I'm testing my O2 sensors, I'm paying attention to how well the cat works. If I'm testing the cat, I'm paying attention to how well the O2 sensor works. So this is a good example where I'm doing kind of a single test procedure, but I can determine multiple things doing the same work, as long as I keep my eyes open and grab the data. So you could test the oxygen storage capacity using a scan tool or lab scope. Newer vehicles, the data is so fast, you should use a scan tool, since connections are and separate much simpler. So anything 2008, we're going to want to be using the scan tool. If I go before 2008, it depends on what kind of car I'm working on. Some of the European vehicles that use an ISO 9141 protocol, you'll see that the frames of data take 700 milliseconds to a second between each frame of data. It is painfully slow to graph data. Other vehicles like Toyota or GM or Ford are very fast at their data, even pre-CAN, and you'll get about 1.5 to 2 frames per second. So pretty common to see about 2 frames per second. Each frame is about half a Mississippi. So that, again, if I'm getting 2 frames per second, that's once every 500 milliseconds. It's not as fast as a lab scope by any means. That's why we can't test, how the response time is of a zirconium sensor. And that's why we get some skewed results for switch ratio testing. However, with OSC testing, we're looking at seconds of time. So if I'm refreshing twice a second and I've got, 20 frames of data, that's 10 seconds of time. So I'm, and I'm looking for something under 2 seconds is always bad. Between 2 and 7 seconds, kind of depends on manufacturer. Hyundai Kia specification is 3.5 seconds. But what I've seen is, if I have a vehicle such as Nissan that uses switch ratio testing, if I have less than 7 seconds of oxygen storage capacity on an OSC test, it can fail the switch ratio test. And that's why that's such a big area. Toyota says normal is 2 to 20 seconds is their published documentation. GM says their minimum time is 1.8 seconds. Well, in my world, 2 seconds is close enough. I'm not getting out and measuring. Yeah, I'm here to tell you, if you're getting less than 2 seconds out of the converter, I don't care if it's 180 or 190, it's bad, right? 1.8 or 1.9 is bad. This is where we're, again, we're trying to make some high level decisions here. We kind of use a phrase, is this the rabbit you want to chase? Before you really go down the rabbit hole and chase it, you want to make sure that other high level tests lead you in that direction. As I discussed, high level tests aren't just for high level tests. They're tests that we can look at from a distance to give us an area on where we need to go pinpoint testing. Traditionally, automotive repair has taught pinpoint tests. And you think about it, we did it in this class. We taught, resistance tests. We taught compression tests. We taught all these other tests, but we didn't put them in context of when would you want to use those particular tests. And that's what high level tests tell us, is which of those pinpoint tests, which area do I need to go test? And that's something that's really left out of traditional automotive education. We teach all the pieces, but we don't tell you when to use them. For example, a car doesn't start. Where do I go? I know all the pieces, but how do I figure out why the car doesn't start? And I struggled this when I was in school, going through an automotive program, and I had a friend of mine who had put an engine together and it didn't start, and he's cranking over. I had no idea how to help him. I'd gone through the entire tune-up, drivability, all that class. I had no idea. I had no idea how to systematically check, did he get the timing correct? Does he have compression? Does he have fuel? Does he have ignition? Are they there at the right time? So something would be very easy for me now. I was completely unequipped and unable to really give any real direction, even though I knew how the pieces worked. I didn't know how to put the pieces together and figure out what's missing. So that's the advantage of high level tests. And that's why you hear me talk about them. And that's why you saw it in some of the videos, like the diagnosing a misfire video. You saw we're very methodically, do I have spark? Do I have fuel? Do I have compression? Do I have those things at the right time? And with only one cylinder being bad, I had to have them at the right time. But if it was a whole engine, I would need to ask that question. So the process I went through on diagnosing a misfire is the same process I go through if the car didn't run at all. Do I have spark? Do I have fuel? Do I have compression? So that the process is the same. And if everything looks good the first time, then I go to the next level tests that are harder and take more time to figure out where the problem is. So that is where we kind of talk about this layering of diagnostics. So OSC converter testing, I'm going to use propane in the intake to richen the mixture for a few seconds until the fuel trims reach negative 20%. And then shut off the propane. So what I want to do is I want to move my fuel trim 20% from where I started. So if my fuel trim, when I add short and long trim together, is plus 10%, I'd want to take away 20%, which would move me to negative 10%. So this negative 20% is not an absolute value. It's a relative change value compared to where I start. If the engine stalls going to 20%, I might need to do it at negative, taking away 10 or 15, but usually 20 works. The reason why we want to try to use this 20% is because I need to add a different amount of propane if I'm working on a 4-cylinder engine or if I'm working on a big V8 engine. But 20% is always 20%. So I need to add more propane to make 20% on a big engine. But it's still the same relative change, which means my test values are going to be consistent, which is what I'm looking for. So since the PCM will have been adapting for the rich condition with the propane on, the lean shift will be dramatic when the propane's turned off. And what I want to do then is I want to see that lean shift and then count the time that it takes the difference between the front O2 sensor going lean and the rear O2 sensor going lean. So in this next example is from a Hyundai, and this happens to be a factory scan tool, but they use zirconium sensors. And I can see here where everyone's reading rich. We take away the propane right here. Both my front sensors drop. And then over here, both my rear sensors drop. And we see they both drop at the same time, which is a good sign, meaning they're equal. Are they equally good, equally bad? Well, it depends on how many Mississippis I have between here and here, doesn't it? right? Because there's no scaling on this capture. So is this 1 Mississippi or is this 20 Mississippis? That's going to be the determining of is it good or bad. In this case, this is 10 Mississippis. This is about 10 seconds on this one. And I know that because of the information I have on the capture. So using the propane gives me a very abrupt shift, very short, and allows me to really see the difference in that time. Now, some scan tools, some manufacturers will give us bidirectional controls, as we saw with Toyota earlier, that I can add on time and take away on time. Those tend to be a little more gradual. So as we look here, here's an air fuel ratio sensor. And we're rich on the air fuel ratio sensor because air fuel ratio sensors read a low signal when they're rich and a high signal when they're lean. And my zirconium oxygen sensor, which reads a high signal when it's rich and a low signal when it's lean. So right here, I shifted it to lean. And right here is when I dropped. And this is gradual, not a great result because it wasn't abrupt, as well as this is actually seconds. So there's a couple factory scan tools that give you it in seconds, not frames. In this case, I've only got 2 seconds, 1, 2 of oxygen storage. That's Toyota's minimum. That's very concerning. Keep in mind, sometimes the tool, can skew that. Now, if you notice, I only have 1 second when I go from rich to lean. And that's why manufacturers tend to go, when I go from lean to rich, that's why manufacturers tend to go rich to lean. They test rich to lean, they don't test lean to rich because it skews the time. So this is where we, are looking for. So this is a very minimal. I can tell there's something in the catalytic converter, but boy, I'm not happy with it. This is bad enough to set a code at this point. This is at the lower end of Toyota's number. So the next question is, does this test result make sense with the mode 6 data from setting the code? Did the system barely fail? We know we're allowed to go down to 49.9% efficiency. So did it test at 50% efficiency? Well, then this result would make sense and would certainly, after testing the O2 sensors, lead me to condemn the converter. It makes sense. On the other hand, if my last mode 6 test passed really good or failed really badly, I would have a little harder time putting this. I might want to retest this using a manual method instead of using the scan tool. So sometimes when I'm doing an OSC test, I have my front O2 sensor is rich, my rear O2 sensor is rich. I take away my fuel, so my front sensor drops lean. My rear sensor is still plugging along. And then my front sensor starts switching again because short-term fuel trim starts working. And is that a problem with the test? Yes, it is. Is it a problem with diagnosing the vehicle? Maybe. My first question is, how many Mississippis are there between here and here? If I've already got 15 seconds of storage, who cares? I've already proved it's good. And the point of this discussion is don't get so focused on the test looking perfect. And this is true with any test. Look at the information you're trying to get from the test. Did I get the answer I was looking for from this test, even though the test isn't perfect? So if this is 15 seconds here, and I can see this is 10 frames of data, I've got about 20 frames of data. So this is probably about 10 seconds of time. I can live with that. That tells me the converter's working. The converter hasn't even started to drop yet, and fuel trims are working. On the other hand, is this 1 second of time? If it's 1 second of time, what I need to do is hold the propane longer. I didn't move fuel trim down low enough. That's why we give you that negative 20% number. So if I only move fuel trim down 5%, I got my sensors all high and I turn it off too quickly, it's going to give me a shorter amount of oxygen storage time. And that's why we use fuel trim to make sure that, hey, we've moved it enough so we can get a predictable time once we shift. So here's a failed OSC test. Here we're using a lab scope. And this happens to be an old Vantage. So we can see here is my front sensor in yellow, my rear sensor in green. I've got 526 milliseconds, which is my delta time. So delta time is the difference between the two cursors, which we talked about when we were talking about scopes. So only 526 milliseconds, which is low. A new aftermarket converter was installed. And although not a great result, we can see we now have just over 4 seconds of oxygen storage capacity. So enough to keep the light off. What's more, we can see a dramatic difference between the two tests. So here's cursor 1, here's cursor 2, and here's my delta time between the two cursors. Now here's another vehicle that failed. In this case, my delta time, and it's measured, my distance between my cursors is 390 milliseconds. Well, if it's 300 milliseconds, 90 milliseconds from the top here to the bottom here, imagine what it is to where it drops. So there's almost no oxygen storage capacity here. And I'm on a 500 millisecond scale. So I can see the 500 millisecond scale and 390 milliseconds for that. So 500 milliseconds for the whole capture. Now, if I look at my next capture, I'm at a 5-second scale. So if I'm on a 5-second scale, so this is per division. So I have each division here. So this is 500 milliseconds, there's 500 milliseconds, here's 500 milliseconds. So 390 is almost 400 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds. So each of these is a division. Each of these small lines is called a graticule. A little bit of math terminology. So as I look here, I'm now on a 5-second scale. So I've had to increase my scale, a lot bigger than 500 milliseconds. So now each one of these divisions is 5 seconds. So here's 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And each one of these small lines is a second. So now if I measure from here where it drops to here where it drops, I can count out the time. And I've got 5, 10, 15, 15 and a half, almost 16 seconds of storage on the same car. So the first one had 390 milliseconds. Now I have over 15 seconds. This was a factory catalytic converter that was installed, not an aftermarket one. So clearly there's some differences between aftermarket, 4 seconds, and factory, 15 seconds. So you are getting something different for those dollars being spent. So that is OSC testing on the catalytic converter. So we're going to manipulate the fuel. And the nice thing about this is it completely takes fuel trim out of it because I'm not reliant on my vehicle's fuel control to test the catalytic converter. Because now I'm in charge of that fuel control. I'm the one taking away propane and removing propane. If I'm doing any of the tests we've talked about previously that were the tests that don't work so good, or if we do a switch ratio test, I'm dependent on what? Fuel trim, because we know fuel trim switches the O2 sensor. So if I have a problem with the O2 sensor, problem with the fuel trim, it skews the results. The magic of the OSC test is that I'm removing that. So now I'm down to just testing the catalytic converter. The other thing that's really cool about this test is I can do a before and after, as you saw here. I can see how much did I have before, how much do I have after. If I'm doing 2 banks, a bank 1 and a bank 2, now I can see, hey, here's my bad bank. Now I put the new catalytic converter on. How does it compare to the one that's been on there for 120,000 miles? Did that new converter I put on, is it only half as good as the one that's been on the car since new? Or is it way better than the one that's on the car as new? And since we have mode 6 tests for the other bank, we already know what the computer thinks of that other bank. So we can quickly determine how good that repair was. So for example, if the other bank's converter had degraded 25%, so not bad enough to replace, but it's not 100%. It's been on the car for 100 and some thousand miles. And I put a new catalytic converter on, and my new catalytic converter does not test as good on an OSC test as that other bank catalytic converter that's original. That means the new catalytic converter I put on is less than 25%, is degraded more than 25%. It's less than 75% efficient, brand new out of the box. Because I already know what the computer thinks of the other bank. I already have some quantitative numbers I can use. On the other hand, if the new catalytic converter I put on is way better than the other bank, then I know that new converter I put on is performing awesome because I know what the computer thinks of the other bank. So this has helped me over time decide, A, what brands do I want to use? The other is it also gives me a lot of confidence that I fixed the car without having to go run the OBD2 diagnostic monitor to verify the converter passes the OBD2 monitor. Because I've already proved it's good because I've compared it to the one that the computer is happy with if I have 2 banks on the vehicle. Even here, doing it before and after on a vehicle with a single bank, I know 15 seconds is good. We had 390 milliseconds before. I know I fixed this car. There's not a doubt in my mind. So this really leads a lot of confidence to, yes, we fixed the car. And I think that's really an important step. We always need to verify our repair. It shouldn't be give it back to the customer. And if it doesn't come back, it must be fine. Because a lot of the times the customer just doesn't bring the car back. They go somewhere else. And then you get a bad Yelp review, a bad Google review, your boss gets a phone call, whatever. So we always want to make sure the car is fixed before it leaves. That's really important. So next up is the punch-through test. So the punch-through test is a test that I developed, and it was something I observed back 25 years ago, probably, testing cats. And there's something I observed, but I didn't understand. And one reason why I didn't understand is they didn't tell us they put cerium in catalytic converters. All they told us was platinum, palladium, and rhodium. So I didn't understand what was happening. But I made an observation while testing cats, while using some of these other tests that we were supposed to use, on how they reacted during testing. And I noticed the cats that tested bad acted a certain way, and cats that tested good acted a certain way. It wasn't until I started teaching again in 2010, and we started doing in the 2011 update that the state put together, had all these cat tests they required us to do. And it wasn't until I started doing those tests, it kind of rekindled what I had observed decades earlier. But now I had better understanding because I'd learned something in the last couple of decades. So I could see what was going on. And over doing 2 years of tests, twice a month with students, because I was doing 2 classes a month for professional technicians, doing this and doing a lab and demonstrating. I was able to see these different tests, and I had shop vehicles that were fairly predictable. And I had a shop vehicle that had the other instructor got a hold of, and it went from passing the cat test to not passing the cat test. And then a couple of months later, it was passing all the cat tests again. But I could see the difference in the numbers. And with doing research, doing a lot of stuff, I came up with a test, came up with some terms, industry terms, understanding what they mean by them, and actually wrote up a couple page paper on doing this test and why it works. And I thought, you know what, I got to be wrong. There's no way I've come up with this. We've been doing this for a long time. There has to be something wrong with my methodology, or wrong with my science, because I don't completely understand things all the time. So I'm writing this up, and I'm sending it to first a couple close friends that are really good techs and seeing what they think and kind of going through. Then I sent it up to some other instructors I knew. Then I sent it up to the state of California and some instructors and the people in engineering that do the engineering for the smog program. Real sharp guys, understand the gas and all that. And the only feedback I got is, yeah, that works. And it was like, really? So I stumbled on something that no one else had done. And the advantage of this test is it allows me to tell, is a converter good or is a converter bad? And this is the only test using a tailpipe that can tell me that. None of the other tests can tell me that. So this is a real important test, especially with what I found is the vehicle that was damaged in the shop passed all the other tests after a couple of months, and we cleaned the converter up and that kind of stuff. But it had failed a punch-through test from the time the converter was damaged on. So it had passed the punch-through test before. After they'd had a severe misfire on it and other things, it never passed it again because the catalytic converter had a meltdown event and lost some of its cerium, and the punch-through picked that up. So it's just kind of all the pieces coming into place kind of put this together. So the first question is, what is punch-through? Well, punch-through is emissions that go through the catalytic converter unchanged. So we have all these microducts. And if I have gas that goes through the microduct all the way without touching the sides, it won't be changed, which means that emission punches through or goes through the catalytic converter without being changed. That's why some modern catalytic converters, instead of having these microducts all square from front to back where you can see through it, they actually twist the bed so that they're forced to come in contact with the sides of the catalytic monolith to force a catalytic reaction, increasing the efficiency of the converter. So when an engine's RPM is changed abruptly, such as during deceleration, rapid acceleration, or shifting gears, there's an increase in emissions from the engine, resulting in an increase in tailpipe emissions that the converter is designed to control. So, converters, we only use the first part of the bed, the first little bit of the bed under normal operation. The rest of it is there to handle these punch-through events, handle all these other things. And that's why when you see this is melted down on the surface, because that's where the catalytic reaction was happening that melted it down. So converters are designed to have this extra capacity to handle these punch-through events. Think about it. I'm flooring the car getting on the freeway. I don't want to be polluting when I'm flooring the car, even though we know we're dumping a lot of extra fuel into the engine to make it go fast. I still can't pollute. So I have to have this extra capacity in the converter punch-through to handle this punch-through event. Well, the thing that allows me to oxidize fuel when my foot is floored, where I have a real rich mixture, is the fact that cerium stores oxygen. So the cerium is able to release that oxygen while I'm accelerating to get on the freeway so that my oxidation converter can oxidize those CO and HC emissions that I'm creating. So punch through is not just a matter of, gee, something makes it through, something makes it through without touching the sides. Punch through is the capacity of the converter, the cerium. So cerium is a big part of that punch through capacity. So if I have excessive punch through, then the converter has to be bad. So the question is, how can I make punch through? By understanding how the converter works and understanding how my fuel control system works. So this can occur when the throttle body is closed by the driver, stopping airflow through the throttle body, and the fuel injector is being closed a few milliseconds later by the computer, causing a delay between the two events. So we talked about closed throttle decel. I said that when you let off the gas on your car, the computer turns off the injectors, and you basically have an air pump as you're decelerating. Well, on a non-drive-by-wire car, the computer is looking at the throttle position sensor. And since the throttle is mechanically attached to my accelerator pedal, the throttle is going to close milliseconds before the computer can go, oh, the throttle's closed, and turn off the injectors. On a drive-by-wire vehicle, it'll actually turn off the injectors preemptively. So I can't do that test on those vehicles, but I really don't need to, because I can do an OSC test on those because all those cars have a front and rear O2 sensor. So I really don't need to do this test on that necessarily. This test is really designed for only fuel-injected vehicles, although there are some carbureted vehicles that'll work on if they have a cutoff solenoid for decel. But I got it certified for fuel-injected vehicles without drive-by-wire. Because, again, understanding that there has to be a delay. If I'm looking at a sensor on a throttle shaft, and I close the throttle shaft, I've just shut off air. It takes time for that signal to get to the computer, and the computer to go, oh, shoot, we need to turn off the injector. So there's going to be a few milliseconds there, a few engine revolutions, because my engine is going at 2,000, 3,000 RPM, means I'm firing those injectors very quickly. I'm going to get some fuel before we turn them off. And so by understanding that and understanding that that's going to happen, now I can do this, right? I can do this in a service bay. I can hold the engine at 2,000 RPM and let go of the throttle, right? And I'm going to do the same thing that happens as I go down the road. So the delay will cause an increase in hydrocarbons that the converter is designed to catalyze, known as punch through. So I have a rich mixture because I've just shut off the air to the engine. We've sprayed in fuel for the amount of air that was previously coming in the engine. So now I'm going to have unburned fuel, hydrocarbons, into the exhaust stream down to my catalytic converter. My catalytic converter has to get rid of those hydrocarbons. So what does my catalytic converter do with those hydrocarbons? Does it reduce them or does it oxidize them? It oxidizes them. Well, if it's going to oxidize them, where's the oxygen going to come from? We have a rich mixture. There's not enough air in the engine. That's why we have the hydrocarbons in the first place. Therefore, the only place that oxygen can come from is the cerium in the converter. It's the only place it can come from. So therefore, now I've taken fuel control out of the system. So I don't care if my fuel control is a little bit out. I've effectively taken the O2 sensors out of the calculation, because even though my O2 sensor is slow or slightly biased, it's not going to affect the results of this test. That's not saying I don't need to test the O2 sensor, but I can do this test before I test the O2 sensor, and it's not going to skew the results of the test. So it makes it a very efficient test to do. So when the engine's at 2,500 RPM, the emissions output will be relatively low once the converter is warmed up. And this can be verified on a gas analyzer when the oxygen content stops dropping and is stabilized. So we know from vacuum, doing our vacuum testing, that my vacuum at idle and my vacuum at 2,500 RPM is basically the same. It's very similar. Consequently, my emissions at idle and my emissions at 2,500 RPM, if the engine's running correctly, will be basically the same. If the engine's not running correctly, you should be fixing the engine first and not doing this test. So what I mean by watching the gas analyzer and the oxygen content, my catalytic converter is a net user of oxygen. So when I first start up an engine cold, I'm going to see about 1%, 1.1% oxygen out the tailpipe. Once my car gets in fuel control and in closed loop, I'm going to see between 0.3 and 0.7%, probably closer to 0.7, oxygen coming out the tailpipe. As the converter heats up, the O2 content in my 5-gas analyzer at the tailpipe is going to drop. It's going to continue to drop till it gets to 0 if the converter lights off fully and it's working. Because the converter uses all the available oxygen. It uses it and stores it. So I should have 0 oxygen or maybe 0.1 coming out the tailpipe. So I can actually watch that oxygen level drop and verify that my catalytic converter is what? Lighting off, that it is heating up and starting to work. So consequently, if I go to do this test and I'm doing it with a cold converter, because things always, just like we talked cooling system, things always test better when you start cold because you're at a good starting point and you can watch things happen. If my oxygen never drops and now my engine's all the way at operating temperature and I still have the same 1% coming out the tailpipe I started with, or 0.7 that I started with, guess what? The catalytic converter's hollow, or it's completely bad because it never started working. We're done with the test at that point. So oxygen on the gas analyzer is a great way of watching and telling you when the converter starts working, because it'll use that free oxygen. Upon release of the throttle, the air will stop milliseconds before the fuel injection system can turn off the injectors, thus causing a hydrocarbon spike. This spike is what's designed to be controlled by the catalytic converter. So the catalytic converter should be able to handle this hydrocarbon spike with an increase in tailpipe emissions of no more than 20 parts per million. So say my engine is at idle, I have 30 parts per million, and at 2,500 RPM, I have 35 parts per million. When I let off the throttle, I better never see it go more than 55 parts per million, which would be my baseline, the amount of hydrocarbons that are coming out the tailpipe while the car is running, plus 20. On the other hand, if there's an increase of over 200 parts per million, in other words, I go over 235 parts per million, that's a bad catalytic converter. What if it's between 20 and 200? That's the waffle range, right? So when I was getting this certified, I wasn't comfortable going, right at 100, it's either good or bad. I wanted something that because I was really expected to get taken apart on this. And I had enough data showing that under 20 was always bad. Always good. And over 200 was always bad. And I had enough data. I had a file folder full of case studies. I had enough data to prove these numbers without a doubt. Does that mean I've never replaced a Cali converter where it has 193? No, it doesn't mean that, because if everything else tests good and I know 193 is not 20, I can't find anything else wrong. It's going to be getting a cat. On the other hand, would I ever replace a Cali converter at 30? No, I wouldn't. Okay, so I know it's weak. I know it's weakened. I know it's not doing the job it should if it's between these two numbers. And obviously, the closer it is to 20, the less weak it is, and the closer it is to 200, the more weak it is. But now I have a scale I can make some diagnostic decisions on. And what I find is I've had cars that literally, I'll hit 2,000 or 3,000 parts per million on hydrocarbons on deceleration. I mean, when these things are bad, yeah, you do get a couple of them that adds 220, and those are the ones you're really struggling to fix, and they're not failing that badly, and they run pretty clean and all that, and they're barely failing. But a lot of times when I do this test, I get 1,000 parts per million, 1,500 parts per million. I mean, this thing's really bad. I mean, there's this, or when I do it and I have a good one, I never see the hydrocarbon bump. I let off the throttle and the numbers never go up. And you think you did the test wrong. No, the converter's working that good. So it's not uncommon to see 0 or 1 or 2 part per million change. A lot of times you don't see any change at all on a good cat, or hardly any change, a couple part per million. And so this is, unfortunately, this is a test that not everyone does. It's been published for a number of years now. I published in 2014. Which means that anyone can use it in the state of California to fix a car. And I've put it in some different classes that have been taught throughout the state. And I've taught it to other instructors at a couple of California automotive teacher conferences. So I've definitely tried to get the word out. But this is the only test. So if I'm working on a car, especially a car pre-OBD2, but any car that's failing a tailpipe test, this is the test I would use to test the Cali converter. If the check engine light's on, I'm going to probably use index ratio or switch ratio. I'm not going to use this test because, again, am I looking at what the computer is looking at, or am I looking at what the 5-gas analyzer is looking at? So that's going to determine kind of what tests I'm going to want to use. And so why is punch through important? Well, Cali converter may pass other conventional tests, but still fail a punch through test due to its diminished capacity. So I've had Cali converters that pass that whole list of tests that I showed you I wouldn't teach you because they're junk tests. Pass every one of them and then badly fail a punch through test, and that's the problem with the car. And this is the only test that can tell me if a Cali converter is good or bad by using a gas analyzer. And so for running a punch through test on the Cali converter, you not only test its ability to convert hydrocarbons, but also its ability to store oxygen. So this is the only test using a gas analyzer that tests the serial. So why is punch through important? The converter's ability to handle punch through is critical when diagnosing an emissions failure, regardless of the gas or gases that have failed. And so I have a little case study example here to kind of drive the point home. So I have a 1999 GMC Safari van that failed a tailpipe test. The van failed NOx with elevated HCNCO emissions. The vehicle passed the visual inspection. There's no pending or confirmed codes, and all of the OBD2 monitors are complete, including the Cali converter monitor, and all the mode 6 tests passed. The converter passed the warm-up test, which was probably my favorite of the old tests, at 85% efficiency. That's pretty good. The converter passed the SNAP O2 test at 0.6% oxygen, and it's allowed up to 1.2%. So it's half of the maximum that's allowed. So on the old test, this thing passed with flying colors, the 2 most popular tests that people use. So now what? What do we do? Well, now it's time to go to advanced testing. Let's use some tests that can actually give us some real answers. So I did a punch through test on it, and I had over 1,000 parts per million in hydrocarbons come out the tailpipe. Clear failure, way over 200. Since this was an OBD2 vehicle, I confirmed the failure by doing an OSC test. The customer authorized a new replacement converter and now easily passed the ASM emission test. The new converter had no hydrocarbon increase when a punch-through test was performed after the ASM emission test. So one of the hard things about generating data was not just, hey, this car failed and look what I got, but it had to be something the customer authorized repairs on. We put new parts on, and then I ran the same test after so we could quantitate the results. That's why it took a couple of years of data collection to get enough data to where I felt comfortable. Here's the converter that I took off. Now, it wasn't rattling. These were wedged in, but this is the wall behind me where I'm taking the picture. So the converter from here up is just gone. Here's the monolith down below. So it's broken. Everything from here up is gone. So this certainly explains why we had too much emissions coming out the tailpipe. A good third of the converter is missing. But yet it passed those two basic tests. You see why I don't teach them to you now?
That's incredible. So basically you overheated, Brian?
Yep.
What would cause that? Because I was thinking, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the cerium. Cerium is gone because of overheating.
Yeah, and so the two things that cause it to fracture like this, most common is overheating. The second can be impact. So impact can be also if the calic converter is not broken incorrectly. So when we replace a calic converter, we actually have to break that new calic converter in. And so what we do is in the service bay, we'll take it up to about 2,500 RPM. And we wait until you get a really bad smell, kind of worse than rotten eggs. And that lets you know there's broken in because there's a code on top of here. But the big thing we're doing is when I showed you the picture of the calic converter, we had the metal shell, we had the biscuits, and there's a blanket that goes around the biscuits. Now that blanket is kind of soft because during shipping, it can change a lot of altitude, different temperatures, things like that. So it has some cushioning effect. But I don't want that cushioning effect the same way on the vehicle. I want to firm it correctly in place. So once we heat it, what happens is that blanket actually pops and becomes firm where it securely mounts the biscuit between the shell and the biscuit, but still has some flexibility for the different expansion and contraction rates. So if you replace a calic converter and do not break it in, and they see this a lot back east in the wintertime because they'll put a calic converter on, they'll go park the car, no one will drive it, get it hot. The customer drives it for a couple months on rough roads. And then when the winter's over, it finally gets hot enough to pop the blanket, but by then the biscuit has already been vibrating, it's undersized. So now it continues to vibrate and come apart. So that is one of the big issues they have with converters. That's probably the number one biggest warranty issues with replacement converters. So you do actually have to break them in order for them to work correctly and last. But no, this was an original converter. So yeah, I think it had an event. And but it is striking to me how it could pass so many tests, including the OBD2 monitor, with a third of the converter missing, and I'm looking right through it to the wall behind where I was taking the picture. And you know, that's kind of a lesson. Don't trust OBD2 to find everything for you. And also that all tests are not equal. Some are clearly better than others. And so when someone says, I tested something, that's why I routinely go, how did you test it? Well, I tested it. No. How did you test it? What methodology? What, you know, how did you determine this? So when someone says, well, I tested it, it's good. Okay, how did you test it? You know, did the test you take can it only tell you if it's bad, like an ohm meter test? An ohm meter test can't tell me if something's good. It can only tell me if the windings are bad, not if they're good. So there's a lot of tests like that in automotive that can't tell me if something's good, but unfortunately we're fooled into believing that if it passes the test, it must be good. No, it just hasn't failed. So hopefully these last two converter tests were kind of eye-opening for you guys and gave you guys some food for thought. This is neat stuff. I love this stuff. You know, my thing that I probably have the most interest in is, at least over the last decade, has been emissions and the chemistry of emissions and calic converters and fuel systems. And that's allowed me to do some really cool original research. I had actually built a test bench for oxygen sensors because a lot of what I was hearing contradicted what I had learned. And yet what I learned didn't make entirely sense. What people were telling me didn't make sense. So I actually built a test bench and spent some time actually testing oxygen sensors to actually understand them better. So, you know, like I said, I tend to, when I get curious, I want to learn more about it. And I don't care if that's something whether it's gardening or woodworking or cooking or catalytic converters. And I think most of us are that way. I think if something piques our curiosity, we'll go look it up. And in case in point, you know, there's IMDb, right? Internet Movie Database that exists because people are curious, right? Well, who is that person in this TV show or this movie? What else did they do? When was this made? Are there any sequels or prequels? Are there, I mean, all those things. Why does that database exist? Because people are curious. People will look up things that interest them. And so I would encourage you, when something interests you, whether it's automotive or anything else, take the time and research it and become an expert on it. Because what I found is just, you know, a one-word answer or a quick answer is usually not the whole picture. And if you're really interested in how it works, you got to really drill down a little bit, and usually end up doing some stuff yourself and trust your own observations. And it's amazing how many times your observations are different than what we're told. Sometimes they're exactly the same and you just prove what you read and you got more comfortable with that knowledge. But I think there's a certain comfort in something we see ourselves. And this next subject is a prime example of that. So we're going to shift gears a little bit out of catalytic converter now. Now we've talked about how the CAT works, and we talked about OSC, oxygen storage capacity. Because I'm going to maintain that rear sensor at a certain voltage based on oxygen storage capacity, I can now use that rear sensor to control the mixture in the engine. And that is what we're doing with rear fuel trim. And rear fuel trim is pretty fascinating. This is something that I was introduced to. I had not heard of it. And I was introduced to it by someone who had seen it, kind of knew the basic theory behind what they were doing, and that was it. So it's like, here you go. Here's this cool thing. Go play with it. And I did a lot of research on it, a lot of playing with it, to where within a year or two, I was back to the person who introduced me to it, explaining to them how it works. And that's continued to this day, as I'm really explaining the fine stuff. So they see a lot of data, they see a lot of stuff. The person who taught me about it has written 50 books now, real smart guy. But he puts things in his books, and sometimes it's, here's this, we really don't know what it is yet, or here's what they're doing, we're not quite sure how they're doing it, or here's kind of what they're doing. And that's a prime example for me to take a concept and then move that concept into where I have enough cars, especially when I was working in the shop, I did have enough cars where I can play with it and look at it and develop that and come back in a way. And that's one of the things I miss about teaching full time, is I don't have that constant influx of customers' cars and customers' problems to kind of build on some of this stuff with. So this is called rear fuel trim. So rear fuel trim has been around for decades, but has only recently become better researched and documented. So Toyota supposedly started using rear fuel trim in 1989. The earliest documentation I can find from Toyota is 1993, and it's actually hidden in a wiring diagram. Something that was on a wiring diagram that was supposed to be erased that someone left on there. It's a tattletale, basically. Letting you know that they're using the rear sensor for fuel control. It's just a footnote on a wiring diagram that someone didn't erase. So that's the earliest written evidence I've seen. I know a couple manufacturers that were doing it in 95, Volvo and Range Rover both did it in 95. How do I know this? Because that's what fixed the car. I was able to prove that that system was working. By the time we get to 2000, we see, you know, manufacturers, BMW and others using it. Toyota's used it forever. By the time we get to 2010, most manufacturers use this strategy. That being said, it was not until 2009 that manufacturers were required to set a code for it. So prior to 2009, manufacturers didn't even need to tell you it was there. So there's a whole lot of vehicles that we have to fix for these rear fuel trim issues. The manufacturer is not telling us that they're using it. Matter of fact, when I was doing the BMW training, and I had the BMW trainers from all over the country, and I was actually teaching them about rear fuel trim. And they didn't know about it. And when I showed them a case study from a 2006 BMW, they're like, I knew they had us put this part in to fix it, but we didn't know why. I've heard the same thing from Nissan techs. Gee, I knew they had us put this part in, I knew they had us replace a rear sensor to fix this problem, but we had no idea why. So they're not even training the dealer techs on this stuff in many cases. They're not even training the trainers who train the dealer techs on this stuff. But yet it's been around on cars for 3 decades. So you see why I kind of like the aftermarket, because the aftermarket, we got to figure this stuff out. The dealer just has to fix the cars while they're under warranty, maybe a little bit after they're under warranty, then they go to the aftermarket. So we get to figure out all these weird things on cars that get old. So the strategy involves the PCM watching the average downstream O2 sensor voltage is indicated by converter efficiency. So we know if my converter is a net user of oxygen, my rear O2 sensor voltage should be at a certain level, somewhere between 650 and 800 millivolts. If I precisely adjust that and say, I want it to run at 760 millivolts, now I could increase fuel or take away fuel to maintain that rear sensor voltage of 760 millivolts. And at 760 millivolts, my car's running clean and I don't have any NOx coming out the tailpipe. So from back in 1983, Bosch said, look, we can control the fuel mixture, control lambda from after the catalytic converter. What we cannot do is control the catalytic converter. So the front sensor's job, which is controlled by short-term fuel trim, is to make the catalytic converter function. Rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean. The rear sensor's job on a modern vehicle is to control the emissions coming out the tailpipe. What's our mixture out the tailpipe? Where are we at? So just like short-term fuel trim will add a lot of injector on time or take away a lot of injector on time in order to switch the front sensor rich, lean, rich, lean. Rear fuel trim can have a huge fuel correction just to move that rear sensor 10 millivolts or 20 millivolts. Because here is where we want it to be. So if it's here, even though it's only half a volt away, not half a volt, 50 millivolts away, it may use a tremendous amount of fuel change to get it to move that extra 50 volts. So don't think that just because you're moving a little bit means it can only be a little bit of fuel. It can be a lot of fuel if the system's malfunctioning. Because you think about it, if my catalytic converter is not working, now I really got to dump a lot of fuel to get that sensor up because I don't have any oxidation in the converter. If the converter is just damaged now, I might need to add 10% extra fuel to keep that voltage. So that's why after a car's had a bad coil or something like that, many times the customer complains their mileage isn't as good as it used to be. Well, it's not good as it used to be because we're having to add more fuel to keep that rear sensor voltage where we want it. So that we're doing what? Running clean out the tailpipe. Because at the end of the day, what do we care about? Running clean out the tailpipe. And so that is the key here. And what's interesting about this, and I'll get to a capture that shows it, we're not moving short-term fuel trim more positive or more negative in order to change the rear voltage, because rear positive and negative just has to do with switching the catalytic converter, rich lean, rich lean. Remember that timing component that I showed you in fuel trim where it goes up and then there's a set time? What we're doing is there's a timing component for rich and there's a timing component to lean. If they're each at 50% of the total time, then we're stoichiometric. What if I spend 45% of my time rich and 55% lean? Then what? The rear sensor voltage would go down. What if I spend 55% rich and 45 lean? Then the rear sensor voltage would go up. I'm just using a big number to kind of exaggerate, but that's what we're doing. So what we're doing is we're not using short-term fuel trim here. We're not just going, gee, full rich, I need to make the rear sensor right because then my cat won't work. We still have to switch the rich lean with the front O2 sensor and short-term fuel trim. What we're doing is we're changing the amount of time we spend rich and the amount of time we spend lean with rear fuel trim. Remember, the computer converts it to binary, rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean. How much time do I spend rich? How much time do I spend lean? That's what rear fuel trim does. Short-term fuel trim moves the oxygen sensor, rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean. Rear fuel trim, how long am I rich? How long am I lean? How long am I rich? How long am I lean? So you see, they both control mixture. They both control lambda. They're both going to affect what comes out the tailpipe. But one is switching quickly so the cat can binge and purge the oxygen out of the cerium. The other is managing what's coming out the tailpipe by controlling the ratio. So it's really fascinating how all these pieces go together. So the better the converter works, the more O2 it will use up, creating high average voltage. The PCM uses the upstream sensor for short-term fuel trim adjustments, but will creep up the amount of time short-term fuel trim stays lean during each cycle in an attempt to run the engine leaner for better mileage. So the other thing we do, and I got some graphics showing up, is that I want my engine to run lean because I can get better fuel economy. But if I run lean under a load, I get high NOx emissions. So if the engine runs lean, but my rear O2 sensor is still richer than 1 lambda, my converter doesn't have oxygen in it, and we're what? Able to reduce NOx. As soon as my rear sensor drops, then I would need to shift back to rich, bring it back up and compensate for the emissions that way, because now I have all this oxygen in the converter. So what? I could run slightly rich for a few seconds, and what? I've got enough oxygen that I can oxidize that HC and CO, and again, I'm going to be cleaning out the tailpipe. So we're constantly cycling back and forth. We see this especially at idle, but we'll see it at cruise sometimes also. So if rear fuel trim hits the limit of adjustment and can't get the desired result, a specific rear fuel trim code may set. Which Chrysler does, even in 2005, but many manufacturers didn't. So many manufacturers would set a code for oxygen sensors or even set a code for front oxygen sensors, and it's actually a rear fuel trim fault. So this is where I go into, again, codes are a symptom, not a diagnosis. Because there's plenty of manufacturers, and I got a case study coming up showing you where we're getting a code for front sensors because the car uses rear fuel trim and there's a rear fuel trim fault. And you're going to see more and more of these cars as these cars get older. I mean, you know, a 2006 car is now 15 years old. So these are the cars that we're going to see a lot more of this weird stuff on. But most applications still don't have such specific codes. Instead, you've got to see the PID relationship and figure it out for yourself. What I can tell you is if you're working on a car and the air fuel ratio sensor connector looks like this, and there's what's called a trimming resistor underneath here. If you pop this cap off, you'll see a big resistor underneath there. Any manufacturer that uses this style of sensor has to use rear fuel trim because it's the only way of calibrating the sensor. They actually use the rear fuel trim to calibrate the front sensor. It's part of the monitor. So, and BMW used this, Nissan used this, GM used, there's a lot of manufacturers that have used this sensor. But this is kind of the canary in the coal mine. If you see this style of sensor, it has to use rear fuel trim because this sensor won't work without it. If it has the Denso style sensor, where it's a normal four-wire connector, it may or may not have rear fuel trim. Certainly if it's 2000 and newer, 2010 and newer, I would expect it to. I'd be very surprised if it didn't. Between 95 and 2010, you know, who makes it? If it's Toyota, I can guarantee it does. Volvo and Rover, I've seen them do it pretty early. I've seen a lot of other, but again, it has to at least be on the table. When we have something that's not making sense, or when the parts we test, we're still getting this code back, we need to ask ourselves, you know what, maybe the vehicle's looking at the back here. Let's kind of play with this a little bit. Let's look at it and see what it's doing. And I'll show you how to play with it. I'll show you what to look for coming up. So our fuel trim relationship, short-term fuel trim controls the switching of the O2 sensor. Long-term fuel trim allows short-term fuel trim to operate correctly. So that's what we learned about in the fuel trim section. Rear fuel trim controls tailpipe emissions for maximum converter efficiency. Some manufacturers say it's there for O2 sensor aging. It's really not O2 sensor aging, it's more converter aging. Would be more correct. So this is the hierarchy. So you can see everything on a modern vehicle is built on rear fuel trim. Short-term fuel trim switches the front sensor, rich lean, rich lean. Long-term fuel trim allows short trim to look normal. So that's our total correction that we're using to switch rich lean, so the catalytic converter will work. Rear fuel trim is what's coming out the tailpipe. That's the amount of time we spend rich and lean. And so here is a example. This is from Ford. And Ford is unique in that they have a rear fuel trim PID. Rear fuel trim PID for Ford is opposite of normal fuel trim. So negative is adding fuel, positive is taking fuel away. Why? Because they want us to make an exploder hit. There's no reason for it. They have it read opposite of all the other fuel trims, but that's what Ford did. So here's my rear sensor. My rear sensor is rich. It drops lean. It climbs back up, goes back rich, and then we see it kind of slightly come back down a little bit. So we can see when we drop, boom, we see a lot of activity here on rear fuel trim. Rear fuel trim shifts more negative. So it wants to add more fuel. But if you notice, it's not just staying in one place. It's actually going part of the time here, part of the time here. So this is our balance, right? So this is, we know that this is lean, this is rich, so this is time. And if I look at the amount of time between here and, oh, come on, between here and here, it's the same as the amount of time between here and here. So this and this are at the same frequency. But now, and I actually pulled cursors out and measured it. So this is the same frequency as this. The difference is the on time. Here I'm spending this much time rich, this much time lean. Once my rear sensor shows that the catalytic converter no longer has oxygen in it, now I spend this much time lean and this much time rich. This much time lean, this much time rich. That's that timing component that I talked about in fuel trim and that fuel corrector. So you can see we're actually duty cycling our fuel control. So very, very cool. This is one of the few manufacturers that actually has good PID data, which really gives an insight to how it works when you reconcile it against other information that's out there. So this is what manufacturers are doing. So this is independent of my short-term and long-term fuel trims and how they switch. So if I look here, here is my front air fuel ratio sensor. And here is my rear O2 sensor. Remember, air fuel ratio sensors read a high signal when they're lean, a low signal when they're rich. So if I look right here, we can see that my rear sensor is high, it comes on, and then it drops, and it drops right here. But when it drops low, saying I'm lean, what does the front sensor do? It goes from lean to rich. So the rear sensor now reads rich. Once it reads rich, what happened? We go back to lean. Who's driving the bus? The rear sensor or the front sensor? The rear sensor is, because the rear sensor moved first. It moved before 10. This didn't move till after 10. So who's the computer looking at? The rear sensor. It moved first. That means that what? This car has rear fuel trim. When you see the rear sensor move before the front, and the front is correcting because now we're adding more fuel so that we can bring this back up. Guess what was the computer looking at? The rear sensor. That's what the computer cares about. So here's another example from Ford. And so here I have my long-term fuel trim. You can see it's not changing at all. Here is my front sensor. Here's my rear sensor. So my front sensor, it's going lean, 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 lean. My rear sensor, which is rich, drops. As soon as it drops, rear fuel trim goes negative, meaning we want to spend more time rich. And what do we see the front sensor do? The front sensor starts going down, rich, rich, rich. And the rear sensor starts coming up to read rich as we get all the oxygen out of the cat. And it'll go over, then this will climb and it'll repeat again. And it constantly does this. In this case, you can see short-term fuel trim did react with rear fuel trim here in order to what? Make the rear sensor. But what's short-term fuel trim reacting to? Is it reacting to the front sensor or the rear sensor? In this case, it's reacting to the rear sensor because it's added injector on time, but my front sensor already says we're rich. So why are we continuing to add that? You can see it slowly as my rear sensor climbs, it's slowly backing off. So Ford's obviously using some short-term fuel trim along with their rear fuel trim in order to get that to move. But you see the importance of graphing these PIDs, because if you don't graph the stuff, you can't see the relationships. The mistake a lot of people make is they just graph one thing or two things and not look at a bunch of things and then go, wait a minute, this moved. What else moved at this time? Did it move just before or just after it? So what's the cause? What's the effect? And this is how we diagnose variable cam timing. This is how we diagnose misfires. This is how we diagnose all kinds of things, is by graphing data and looking at relationships. So I have 3 case studies to look at. So passive rear fuel trim case study number 1. Fails tailpipe emissions with the check engine light off. What now? Performing a lambda calculation could determine if the vehicle is in fuel control. Even though the mill is off, checking for codes and monitors should still be part of the initial diagnosis. So this is a vehicle I had in the shop, a little 2005 Chrysler PT Cruiser, failed smog by a large amount. And check engine lights off. So this is about discipline. What process do I use? So the first thing I want to do is do a lambda calculation because it failed the tailpipe emissions. And my lambda calculation is you had 2,300 parts per million of NOx. I should have a lot less. And so the question is this car running rich? Is it running lean, or is it in fuel control? So by putting these numbers in the calculator and then pushing the calculate button, I can see that I'm out of fuel control. My lambda is at 1.023. That means stop worrying about NOx. I don't care about NOx anymore, even though that's what failed. I don't care about it. I care about fuel control. So now what's fuel control? Fuel control is my O2 sensors, my injectors, my fuel system, right? So it's all about fuel control now. So the vehicle is out of fuel control. This could cause the emissions problem and must be fixed first, because we know a lean vehicle creates more NOx. So again, this is a plausible answer as to why it could be failing. So any vehicle failing the emissions portion of the smog inspection should have the monitor and code status checked. All the monitors were complete, but there was a code in mode 3. Turns out it's not an emissions code, which is why the light was not on. And the code was P2097, so a manufacturer specific code. The definition was downstream fuel trim rich, bank 1. Well, this car only has 1 bank. Didn't I say the car's running lean? So the car's running lean, but I have a code for downstream fuel trim rich. So this is where you have to step back a minute. If I'm a computer and my downstream sensor is rich, what am I going to do? I'm going to take away fuel, right? So since we know from Lambda that the vehicle is actually running lean, the computer is able to take away fuel. Time to think about maybe a problem with the O2 sensor at this point, right? You see where the mind, this is the first rear fuel trim case study I ever did. It's the first rear fuel trim car I ever tried to fix. I had heard about rear fuel trim. That opened my ideas that, okay, and hey, I got a code. I'm excited now. I get to practice some of what I'm learning and researching. But I really didn't have a system for diagnosing it at this point. So I was pretty clumsy on diagnosing this one because I really had more questions than I had answers. And you'll see by the time we get to the last one, you guys will be telling me what to do next. So this code indicates the PCM is removing more fuel than is allowed. I still got to fix that typo. And still the rear O2 sensor voltage is too high. Could this cause a PT to run lean during an emissions test? Right, which I think we just agreed it could. How could I diagnose the problem? That's the hard part. How am I going to diagnose this? Okay, I have right, because diagnosis is gathering information, coming up with a hypothesis. My hypothesis is this is causing me to run lean. Then I need to prove or disprove the hypothesis. And sometimes that third step has hung me up for a day. Sometimes I've gotten to the first 2 steps. I've gathered information. I have a hypothesis. I have no idea how I'm going to prove or disprove it. I need to walk away from the car, go do something else, and think about a test I can come up with to prove or disprove my hypothesis. So how would I diagnose the problem? So again, I'm kind of spitballing here. Could mode 6 help? Maybe. How about test drive, fuel trims, O2 sensor operations, right? So what am I doing? I'm looking through my toolbox here. I'm looking through my list of resources. What do I have that might give me an answer to whether I'm on the right track or not? No different than looking through your toolbox for the right size wrench or the right size screwdriver. I'm looking through my toolbox on a vehicle, going, which tools do I have? What scan tool functions do I have? What other things can I do to help prove whether I'm correct or not? So my mode 6 data, I do have a failed test for purge function, which I'm not terribly concerned about right now. But again, it goes in the nice to know, may need it later category. I do have a test here for my bank 1 sensor 2 lean 0.196, which is the maximum that's allowed. It should be underneath that number. So the sensor definitely on the last test had a hard time reading lean. And we know if I'm doing a test with a lab scope, I'd want to be under 175 millivolts. The threshold here for testing is 196 millivolts, and that's as low as it could get it to go. The rich side, it was okay on. So I got kind of something kind of maybe pointing. This is the same tool that you saw yesterday when I was on Nissan, except for what I did this time is I told it I'm working on a Chrysler Next Generation 2 controller for 05 or 06. So it automatically decoded everything, which is pretty slick. So I can do that with a whole lot of different manufacturers with the software, which is just a neat thing. So I went for a test drive and I used the feature to graph my short-term and long-term fuel trim. So we're going to combine it into one number. And I start off at idle and I'm pretty good. And at higher RPM, I'm pretty good. But right here in the middle, we're taking away 11 to 12% injector on time. Well, at 1500 to 2500 RPM, that's exactly my speed that I'm on a dyno doing a smog inspection. So when I failed under those speed and load cells, my computer is taking away fuel and I'm running lean. Well, we know that fuel trim and the computer's ability to take away fuel responds directly to the O2 sensor. So let's test the O2 sensor. So in this case, I'm using the same tool with the graphing software. And I have my front sensor right here and my rear sensor right here. So my front sensor is switching. And at the end, we made it rich with the throttle position by flooring it. I got to 780 millivolts, which is a little bit low. It definitely needs to be tested. It may have a bad front sensor. They can't see rich, but my rear sensor went to 1.27 volts. More importantly, on my whole test drive, it never went below 800, even though I had forced it lean at one point. So this tells me that my front sensor that can go from 0 to, the last point here, 780, which is the last point. I was higher than that. So I can go from 0 to 800 millivolts here. Here I can only go from 800 to, I'm at 1.27. I'm only supposed to go to a volt. That certainly sounds like a problem with my rear sensor. So I put a new rear sensor in it. I didn't clear codes. And the reason why I didn't clear codes is I didn't want to have to go run the OBD2 monitors. Remember, my check engine light's off. The monitors are complete. As far as the OBD2 system, this car is clean. Matter of fact, today, this car would have passed smog because we no longer tailpipe test these vehicles. All we do is an OBD2 inspection and make sure there's no monitors, make sure there's no, the check engine light's not on and the monitors are complete. So if this vehicle was tested on a new platform today, it would have never failed. It would have never been fixed. However, this vehicle was done prior to 2015 when we still gave them a tailpipe test. We can see that it did fail badly. We have a rear O2 sensor that, given the what we're seeing in the code we have, certainly makes sense. If the rear sensor can't go to low voltage, then the computer is going to kill itself trying to take away fuel to make it go to low voltage. So we put a new sensor in. I went out on a test drive of about 6 to 8 miles to let the computer kind of relearn its speed and load tables, right, to adjust for the new part I put in. Came back and I ran another smog inspection on it. And now these are the numbers I got. We went from what, 2,300 and something parts per million to 2. Lambda is now 1. So this little PT Cruiser did not have an EGR valve. It was pretty ugly, over 100,000 miles, factory Cali converter. What I can tell you is if this car had been in any other shop, it would have gotten a new Cali converter and probably still not passed or barely passed. Apparently, this car did not need a Cali converter. This car needed a new rear O2 sensor. Pretty amazing how much fuel control affects emissions. We went from over 2,300 parts per million to 2. And the issue I have is this problem would never be caught today, because the code didn't turn the check engine light on, because the engineers didn't have to until 2010. If they don't have to turn it on, they're not going to. Hey, that's a warranty repair. That lowers profits. So this is, and I had this data when they were looking at the new regulations, and I was be opposed to going the direction they did because I had so much of this type of data. But politics wore out. And so we don't fail for this anymore. So even though we have a program in California, the smog program designed to, clean the air, this is a great example of it's not about cleaning the air. It's about politics, and it's about what we're going to test at any given time. So the video we played on emissions where they said, hey, what's real concerning is some of the visible stuff is coming back. Of course, the visible stuff's coming back because we're not fixing these cars anymore. So here, just for fun, because it was the first one I did, I went out and did the same test drive. You can see now I'm adding 5% fuel in the same speed and load cells I was taking away 11 or 12%. That's a 15, 16% change in injector on time. That's huge. Bet you the car will run a little better now too. And I graphed the sensors, and now I can make the sensor go to 0 volts. And it goes high. So now the rear sensor sees high and low. So this first test gave me a lot of tools on how I'm going to diagnose these in the future. So when I got my next one here, I was already thinking out of the box. So this one here is a 2005 Infiniti G5. Customer complained of the check engine light on, scanned for codes and found a P1283 present. I test drove the vehicle and the performance was okay. So my P1283 code is for the air fuel ratio sensor on bank 1. This is all the scan tool tells you. That's not a lot of information. So it's airflow sensor 1, bank 2, 1283. So code 1283 is for the bank 2 front sensor, no activity. In other words, the front sensor on bank 2 is not switching. The vehicle uses air fuel ratio sensors. Probable causes, according to the manufacturer and Identifix. Possible causes were a bad sensor, wiring, or exhaust leaks, according to the manufacturer information provided in the diagnostic flow chart. There's actually a TSB where bolts are falling out of a heat shield, causing an exhaust leak, wiring, and a bad sensor. When I went on Identifix, there was several hundred posts where they put a sensor in it. There was a couple posts for an exhaust leak, and it might have been a wiring. That's all there was. So these were the only options that could be wrong. So, okay, so I've got some information. I have an idea of what I'm looking for. At this point, I'm looking for a front sensor that doesn't work because that's what everything's telling me. So I looked at my freeze frame data, and I'm on the manufacturer side on this Infiniti. So my freeze frame data looks a little bit different. So when I look at fuel trim, you see 98 and 109, and you're not used to seeing that. So some manufacturers, Honda and Nissan primarily, use what's called alpha. So alpha means that 100 equals 0% fuel trim. Anything below 100 is taking away fuel trim. Anything above 100 is adding fuel trim. The numbers equal the percent. So basically I have 2% negative and 9% positive, except for because it's displayed in alpha, it's 109 and 98. So it's kind of confusing when you first look at it, but this is an example of why certain things are easier to fix in generic, where I'm seeing the numbers displayed the same way every time, than going into the enhanced side. And then when I get in the enhanced side, which I am here on this Infinity, things are really confusing because wait a minute, what do they mean 109 and 98? That's not how I learned field trim. Well, Honda and Nissan do this. It's called alpha. And it's real easy once you know that 100 equals 0 and anything above 100 is positive, anything below 100 is negative. So if I look at my bank 1 fuel trim, I've got 2% negative, 9% positive, so 7% total positive fuel trim. My bank 2, I've got 6% positive and 3% negative, so 3% positive fuel trim. So I have slightly more fuel or injector on time being added on bank 1 than I do on bank 2. Other than that, not a lot of useful information here. It's happening at, low calculated load, operating temperature, 43 miles an hour, cruising down the road. Okay, so it's I'm not getting a lot of information here, but I am getting enough. I can see absolute throttle position percentage is 1, so it gives me the throttle here. But my calculated load already told me that 15% calculated load leads my foot's off the gas, basically. So I already knew that, even if this wasn't here, because my low calculated load. So this is light cruise, foot basically off the gas. So idle, except for we're going down the road fast. So let's look at some live data. So here's some live data. So I have my bank 1 front sensor, my bank 2 front sensor, my bank 2 rear sensor, and my bank 1 rear sensor. So these are diagonal from each other. So this is my front sensor for bank 1. This is my rear sensor for bank 1, front sensor for bank 2, rear sensor for bank 2. So if I look at my 2 front sensors, bank 1 is at 1.46 volts. Bank 2 is at 1.29 volts. So since these are air fuel ratio sensors, it's obvious they're not the same. One has a much lower voltage than the other, which means one side has to be richer than the other side. And with air fuel ratio sensors, the lower the voltage, the richer the mixture. So in this case, bank 2 is richer than bank 1 in front of the converter. Now let's go after the converter. So here is my bank 1. It's at 860 millivolts. My bank 2 is at 490 millivolts, and the highest it ever got was 670. So since these are regular zirconium sensors, we can see that bank 1 is richer after the converter than bank 2 is. So how can I be richer in front of the converter but leaner after the converter compared to the other bank? Well, a couple possibilities, right? I could have an exhaust leak. Could have a bad sensor, either front or rear. I mean, I have a code for a bad front sensor. Maybe my front sensor is just bad.
So the leak would be in between the 2 sensors. That would be the catalytic converter, right?
Yeah. So my leak, if it was an exhaust leak, it would have to be between the front and rear sensor for my front sensor to read rich and my rear sensor to read lean. Correct.
Wow, this is amazing stuff.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I don't know what's wrong. All I know is possibilities. So, and I'm suspecting, I don't know, I'm suspecting the vehicle may use a refuel trim. Because that's another possibility, isn't it? If my rear sensor is low, we would add more fuel to the front, but the manufacturer doesn't tell me they do that. But again, it's on the list. So what do I need to do? I need to start somewhere. So let's test the sensors. Can everyone see rich and can everyone see lean? So I get the propane out and I'm going to make everyone go lean and everyone go rich. So, and I'm just going to look at my minimum and maximum voltages. So my rear sensors went to 960 and 910 and 50 millivolts and 50 millivolts. Can they both see rich and both see lean? Can they both go under 175 and both go over 800? Yeah. So my rear sensors clearly are good. They can see rich or lean. So let's see if my front sensors can. So my front sensor on bank 1 went to 690 millivolts. Bank 2 went to 780. Bank 1 went to 4.43 volts and 4.51. So these are similar, right? I mean, there's really not something that shows there's a problem here. They're very close. Certainly not something I'm ready to start putting parts on with. So now I'm going to clear everything out, clear all my memory out, and get rid of my adaptive strategy and let things relearn. And I'm going to do what's called a timed activity test, where I start it up cold. Let's watch, see what everybody does and see how they learn. And I've zoomed in here a little bit. So now I have my bank one front sensor and my bank one rear sensor. So now they're directly on top of each other. I don't have control of this. The scan tool kind of automatically puts things places. I've never figured out. It has to be something with how I tag them and what order I tag them, but I haven't figured out how to really do that yet.
It's for this.
Yeah.
It's for this. For this test, does the car needs to be driven, or it can be done just idle?
At this, I'm doing it just idle. I've cleared all my codes, cleared all my memory, started the car up, not touched the gas. I just want to see how it learns what it does, right? Because I had a difference in voltage, but is that a learned difference that it can't unlearn? Or is there something wrong causing it to learn? So I wanted to get rid of all my memories, start it up, just idling, and let's see basically where the water levels at, basically see where it ends up at. And that's what I'm doing here. So I started at 0 frame. I'm up to frame 450. And this sensor is behind this sensor. This sensor is behind this sensor. So if I look here, I can see my rear sensor voltage is high. My air fuel ratio sensor comes up. It's active, goes up to a volt, up to here. Here's where it's the highest. And as it's high here, we can see I'm dropping a little bit, because remember, higher voltage is lean. So it comes up to about here. We start dropping. As it drops, this starts dropping. This makes a correction and starts going back up right here. And this flat lines, and we end up at 1.5 volts. Remember, I'd never seen this before. I'm trying to make sense of something I'm looking at and trying to see if I can come up with something that fits the description of what might be happening. So here, my rear sensor again starts high. My front sensor starts low. They started pretty close within a frame of each other. So this started at 1452 and this started at 1452. And I'm looking for that. That means the heaters on both O2 sensors are good, because they started in exactly the same frame or within a frame of each other. So I know they're working. Now we come up, it's active. I come up here, here's where I plateau, just like I did on the other side. My sensor is starting to come down. As my sensor starts to come down, we're taking away fuel. I'm sorry, we're adding fuel, adding fuel, adding fuel as the sensor's dropping. And when the sensor starts going back up, we flatline, and I end up at 1.2 volts. So is the computer looking at the front sensors, or is the computer looking at the rear sensors? It's looking at the rears, isn't it? Because we don't flatline until the rear sensor starts going back rich. So the reason why I end up at 1.2 volts is that's how rich it had to get before the sensor would start going back up. So we know my sensors are good. I've checked for exhaust leaks. I don't have any. And I just proved that the 1.2 volts is learned. It's not a bad sensor. It's a learned value. And it's learned because what? This vehicle has rear fuel trim. And we proved it because the computer's looking at the rear sensor. And we can see that as this comes down, and I have this frame here and this frame here, what happens? Right here is where this flat lines. Same thing here. As this is coming over, as this starts to go up finally, that's where we flatline. It's looking at the rear sensor. It's going to add fuel until the rear sensor voltage starts to climb, meaning it's looking at the rear sensor. I also noticed that this one went down much lower than this one did. Well, as we talked about rear fuel trim, what makes rear fuel trim work? The catalytic converter. The catalytic converter oxidizing is what creates that high voltage on that rear sensor without having to overfuel. So let's test the catalytic converters, even though that wasn't on the list of possible causes. But because we understand catalytic converter operation, we understand OSC testing, and we understand that rear fuel trim is based on catalytic converter efficiency. Let's go test the cat. We don't have any exhaust leaks. So as I
So
look at the catalytic converter, what's that?
So when the let me put my words together. So when a catalytic converter gets no, I can't. Let me see. I just keep thinking like how many customers are paying for a catalytic and the problem is something else. And so if the converter is replaced, it will also get new sensors.
Well, a lot of times that happens. They load both barrels of the shotgun because
It's scary.
one time the car came back and they had to put sensors in it. So now as a policy, they just always put sensors in. So they're not good enough to diagnose. They don't understand. They just sell enough parts so the car stays fixed. And the customer pays a higher repair bill. So time to test the converter. So here I'm doing a switch ratio test, obviously. And what? I've got my my rear sensor on bank one, front sensor on bank one, 2 flat lines, 780 millivolts here, just like in the range that we talked about. This side here, my rear sensor is moving like crazy and my front sensor is fairly smooth. I can zoom out to 1,000 rounds of data. And what I found was at idle, everything looked kind of okay. But when I revved up, you really saw the activity. The other interesting thing is see how at idle, I had high voltage here, meaning the converter is oxidizing. My output voltage is high, which is what I'd expect to see on a car that uses rear fuel trim or a car that uses OSC testing. Here, when I'm at idle, my rear sensor is low, which I would see on an early OBD2 vehicle or a car with a bad cat. And so the catalytic converter is what was causing the problem. It was interesting here because this is only available as a dealer. And my service advisor was really nervous because there was nothing saying the catalytic converter could cause this problem. There was nothing in the manual. There was nothing in Identifix. No one had ever put a catalytic converter on to fix this problem that had reported in Identifix. When I did put the new catalytic converter on, I ran the same test I did previously. We can now see that the bank 2 catalytic converter voltage actually goes up higher faster than the bank 1 that was good. And I can see that my voltages that are learned is 1.44 and 1.43. So they're now basically the same. What's interesting, when I showed this case study at some classes I've had factory Nissan techs in, they knew that they'd been told to put catalytic converters on to fix this code. They had no idea why. So in other words, they've called how it works at a dealership is once you get to a certain point, they don't want you spending any more time on it. They want you to call the help desk. And the help desk is national. So they can see based on codes, what parts have fixed this car. So instead of having the dealer tech diagnose it, they'll say, go put this part on because we know this part fixes it 85% of the time. This fixes it 80% of the remaining times. So they go through and so it doesn't require the dealer technician to really understand how it works. They're just told the next part to put on based by statistical data of what fixes that problem. And that's why when there's a real problem, the dealership really can't figure it out or really struggles to figure it out. I'm not going to say they can't. They really struggle to figure it out because the whole system, the whole dealer system is designed to fix 80% of the cars. And if you use factory flow charts and factory information, you're going to fix about 80% of the cars. The other 20%, you need to understand things like this or you can't fix them. And there's plenty of techs out there that make a living that are 80% techs. They only fix 80% of the cars, they guess at the rest. But what do you think the desirability is? And what do you think the career trajectory is of technicians who can fix that last 20%? Right? I mean, that makes you much different than everyone else who's applying for a job. And this is learned, it's learned over a lot of years, but it's learned by asking questions. I didn't know the answer when I fixed this car. Matter of fact, we put a new front sensor on, even though I didn't think it would fix the problem. It's part of the diagnostic process just to prove it wasn't a problem because no one could believe that it was a catalytic converter, even including myself at this point, because this was one of the early tech cars I fixed. because there's nothing written on it. So I'm really going out on a limb here. I'm actually going way out of what is written anywhere saying, I really think this is the problem. And we sold the O2 sensor to the customer, explaining to them that the factory procedure says we need to put this in a retest, but we really don't think this is it. I was clear to my service advisor. Service advisor was not as clear to the customer, I found out later. Because I really suspected I had a bad Cali converter, but I really wanted to make 100% sure I didn't miss anything. So part of learning sometimes is bringing the customer in and let them know, look, this is what I think, this is what I see, this is what the factory recommends. This is $200, this is $1,500. What do you want to do? You know, so this again, learn. So when I saw the next one, I didn't second guess myself. I was much more confident. So here again, verifying the repair, we can see where they learned. And you can see how good the voltage is on the other 920 millivolts. So here's a third one. This is a BMW. This happened to fail tailpipe emissions. So 2006 530. Failed 2 smog inspections with high tailpipe emissions, 147,000 original miles. Another shop had attempted repairs with little success. No visual failures, and the check engine light was not on. The Bank One front O2 sensor appears to be new, I noticed during my visual inspection. So here's where it failed the first time. We're failing for hydrocarbons. So you can see, and we're failing for CO. So you can see my measured number is 0.63. I'm only allowed 0.48, measured 0.66, I'm only allowed 0.46. On hydrocarbons, I'm allowed 451, I had 57. I'm allowed 35 and I had 49. So you can see, we're not talking something like, gee, it needs spark plugs, or gee, there's a big problem here. We're talking, there is something that's just a little bit out. And that can be really hard to diagnose. I used to struggle with this a lot because you'd think that, you know, as a layperson, gee, if it's only a little out, it's easier to fix. No, if I had 5% CO and 500 parts per million, it would be easy to fix. This is hard to fix. The smaller the failure, the harder it is to fix. It's also interesting to note this is a 2006 vehicle that would not fail today because we don't test for this. Here's the second one. And we can see here that we're now passing at the 15 miles an hour on hydrocarbons, still failing at 25. We're still failing at both speeds on CO. NOx has come down just a little bit. And this was after the last shop at attempted repair. So this was the before repair, after repair from the last shop. So first steps, perform lambda calculations, right? How's the vehicle running? Is it in fuel control? Check monitor status. Check for codes, both confirmed and pending, and check both the generic and the enhanced side of the PCM for codes. So my lambda calculation at 15 miles an hour on the first test is 0.980, 25, 0.979. My second test, 0.979 and 980. So I'm clearly out of fuel control. I'm outside of the 980, but I consider 0.980 a fail. That's the limit end. If I'm at 980, I have a problem. But I'm at 979, which is even less than that. So we clearly have a fuel control problem, which again makes sense because I have high CO. CO is a lack of oxygen, and Lambda says we're running slightly rich. So this is, again, can what Lambda is telling me make sense with what I have? The other thing is we know my converter efficiency for oxidation, HC and CO, goes down the richer I get. So my hydrocarbon failure could simply be that I'm running too rich for my catalytic converter to oxidize my hydrocarbons. It may not be an engine problem at all. So you see where tune-up, spark plugs, you know, all those things, I shouldn't be focusing on, because if I can pick up 20% of converter efficiency or 30% of converter efficiency, I bet you I get rid of 10 parts per million. You see how that's where that graph is really important to understand. I'm running rich. Running rich is going to explain CO because we know CO is a lack of oxygen. I'm going to lose converter efficiency, which could explain why I'm slightly failing on hydrocarbons. So don't get distracted by the hydrocarbons here. Don't even get distracted by the CO. This is all about fuel control at this point. I don't care about anything else. So when I check for codes, I have no codes during the last drive cycle. So this is mode 7. I have no set codes in mode 3. So now I'm going to go out of generic and I'm going to go into the enhanced side of the PCM. And the enhanced side of the PCM, I found a code 2C31. Huh? Yeah, that's BMW speak. Doesn't exactly follow the rules of OBD2. Oxygen sensor before CAT trim control. What does that mean? Great question. BMW doesn't tell you. But this code can't turn the check engine light on, but it's there. And since I'm failing for high CO, Lambda tells me I'm running rich. This certainly seems like a breadcrumb. There's something going on here. So this at least leads me to start looking at the O2 sensors. And it's kind of interesting. Oxygen sensor before CAT trim control. What's trim control? Right? I mean, it's not saying stuck rich, not saying stuck lean, not saying not switching. It's not saying it's not becoming active. It's saying there's a trim control problem. So I'm going to look at my sensors. So here, now the bottom pit is oxygen sensor control, active or inactive. That's saying open loop or closed loop in BMW speak. So I have my oxygen sensor bank 1, sensor 1, oxygen sensor bank 2, sensor 1, oxygen sensor bank 1, sensor 2, oxygen sensor bank 2, sensor 2. So my front sensors, just by the scale, 1.8 or 2.1 volts, they have to be air fuel ratio sensors. Especially look at the lack of activity on, which is typical of air fuel ratio. So if I look at these, bank 1 is at 1.8 volts. Bank 2 is at 2 volts. What side's richer? Well, the one with the lowest number. So bank 1 is slightly richer than bank 2. So now let's look at my rear sensors. My rear sensor, my bank 1 rear sensor is at 600 millivolts. My bank 2 rear sensor is at 800 millivolts. So here I have a situation where bank 1 is richer before the converter, but leaner after the converter compared to bank 2. So now I'm down to the same possibilities. We've been here before. This is like our Nissan with a different code, right? I'm seeing the same pattern I've seen. So my possibilities are exhaust leaks, bad O2 sensors, bad catalytic converters, right? So what do I need to do? I need to what? What's the easiest thing to test? Well, the easiest thing to test for is what I can look for exhaust leaks. I can test my O2 sensors. These are easy things to test, right? So we look for exhaust leaks. There were none. We tested the O2 sensors, and now I'm back in generic and I'm looking at more data. So I'm looking at actually 8 things here, or no, 10 things, excuse me. So I've got my front sensor, and see now it's measured in milliamps, where in the enhanced side it's measured in volts. Do I care or no? Because I know low is rich, high is lean, right? So the scaling doesn't matter, but it does confirm I'm looking at an air fuel ratio sensor. So I've got my bank 2 sensor 1 here, my bank 2 rear sensor here, and my bank 1 rear sensor here. Short-term fuel trim for bank 1 sensor 2. I was looking for a rear fuel trim pit. It's not supported, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Then I have my short-term and long-term fuel trim. So short-term fuel trim on bank 2 is negative 2.3. Long-term fuel trim on bank 2 is 1.6. So bank 2, I'm at a net of negative 0.7. Bank 1, which is running richer, has 0 on short-term, but 4.7 on long-term. So we're talking a 5% difference in fuel trim between the two banks, and the computer is adding more fuel on the bank with the rich front sensor and the lean rear sensor. I'm starting to think maybe the computer might care about the rear sensor. I don't know, BMW doesn't tell me, but that would make sense. So let's take a look here. So the question is, do I have a bad converter or a bad O2 sensor? So let's look at our sensors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange them from rich and lean. So again, I'm going to use my propane, and I'm zoomed in here pretty tight. And I can use the scale on the end. So my current went from 0.043 or 0.129, which is pretty similar, to negative 2.3 or negative 2.5. Again, similar. I don't know these enough to say that's a problem, but at least they both move. So let's see what the rears do, because I know what zirconium sensor should do. So this sensor went up to 940 millivolts. I haven't checked it for low voltage yet. This sensor only went to 710 when I added propane. Don't I have to go over 800? That's the rule, isn't it? I got to go over 8 and under 175. So the rear sensor on bank 1 is no good. We just proved that. What about the cat? I don't know until I put a new rear sensor in, right? Because if I'm going to OSC test, I need to have a sensor that can actually see rich and lean, or it's going to affect the amount of time. So we put a new rear sensor in. Then I confirmed that the sensors work. So I did the same propane test. Things have moved a little bit. So here is bank 2 front sensor and bank 1 front sensor. Here's bank 2 rear and bank 1 rear. Well, now what? 805 millivolts, 865 millivolts. Can both my rear sensors see rich now? Which is all I'm trying to confirm here. I also looked at the enhanced data and see that what we're spending a lot more time at 1.9, and my rear sensors now are more consistent, 0.7 on both. This one keeps going to 0.8. And what we're moving fuel control to get it back to 0.7. Time to go drive the car. So again, I didn't clear codes. I didn't want to run monitors. I just went and drove the car. Come back and let's do a test. So I came back and did a final test. And now I'm at 0.18 and 0.19 CO, only 3 parts per million of NOx, 16 parts per million of hydrocarbons and 14 parts per million of hydrocarbons. And I'm using all the oxygen available. When I checked Lambda, I'm at 0.994 at both speeds. Car's fixed. So the other shop apparently read the description. Front O2 sensor must need one. Trim control makes sense now, doesn't it? This car uses rear fuel trim. Did I know that going in? No, I proved it by watching the relationship of the sensors.
And so,
go ahead.
So driving the car without erasing the code and putting the new sensor, and that was so that it can relearn and give you new values.
Right. And the other thing it did, because this was a failed smog, the monitors have to be complete for smog. I didn't want to spend an hour or 2 driving the car to get the monitors complete. So since I'm a lazy flat rater and I get paid by the job I do, not by how long it takes me, and I know the rules are that we don't fail the car for the codes in Mode 3. We fail it if the check engine light's on. I knew the car would pass the OBD2 inspection portion of the test. All I care about is the tailpipe emission. So I put the new part in, but I understand I need to go drive it for the adaptive strategy to relearn. Because if I just put the part in, pulled it over to the smog bay and ran it, it would still fail. I needed to go drive it so those speed and load cells, that adaptive strategy we talked about, would relearn.
Okay.
All righty. So pretty cool stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So kind of some neat stuff. So tomorrow I'm going to show you guys something else really cool. I'm going to talk about volumetric efficiency and volumetric efficiency testing, which is a high level test that we use by using a scan tool and a little bit of common sense, and can actually figure out real quickly if something like a mass airflow sensor is bad, or if I have a plugged catalytic converter or things like that. So it's a high level test that gives us a pretty clear direction a lot of the time. Very quickly. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that tomorrow, and that'll probably only take an hour or so. And then my thinking tomorrow is I'll cut you guys loose at 9 or there when I get done with the VE. And then I'll open the test up early since we have that engine and emission test open up tomorrow. And that way you guys can get a head start on it and have some extra time. Sound like a plan?
Sounds like a plan.
Yes.
All
Thank
righty,
you.
everybody. Have a great rest of your day. And I see I got something in chat here. Oh, why no 420 code? Great question. And this goes back a little ways to the previous one. It's because of the logic of the system. Great question, Christopher. So what the issue is on that system, and a lot of these that use rear fuel trim, is they test the catalytic converter before they test the O2 sensors. And so the threshold on the catalytic converters just does it store oxygen, not how well does it do it. And so we see this also with monitor issues where it can't calibrate the front sensor. So they seem to have loosened up the parameters on the catalytic converter testing on these. to where it'll do it. The other thing that reason why it might not have set it is that the monitors were all complete, but it had this other code, and once it has that other code set, it won't test for the Cali converter. So the Cali converter could have run a monitor test and passed at one time, and then not met the enabling conditions to run another test as it degraded. And then it set the O2 sensor code on the Nissan before it set the Cali converter code. But you're right, it should have set a Cali converter code. But apparently OBD2 missed it by like this much. Yeah, Geraldo.
How you doing, sir? I'm just calling because I did a emission control system PowerPoint review test, and it says right here that it's supposed to be 2 attempts to do the test. It just gave me 1, and never gave me.
Let me fix that.
It's
What's the number?
12.2.6 emission control system.
Let me fix that.
Yeah, I was like,
Sometimes
so
when I move
like
on from one shell to the next, Canvas has its way and changes my settings. So I'll go fix
yeah,
that.
and I was gonna try again the next day, and
No problem. I'll fix it so you can try again.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I learned a lot about like the smoking and how to check the color converter. I did have the same problem when I got my Mustang that didn't pass the smoke, and I didn't know what it was. So I started like checking the sensors with voltage and everything. And then I couldn't find nothing wrong with the sensors, the oxygen sensors. So I jumped to, because I know it wasn't a catalytic converter, because it has 2. It's a B6 3.8. So I went to do the vacuum test, check for leaks. And then what I found out. And when I found out that it was like the leaks on the manifolds that I replaced right away. As soon as I replaced them, the code went away.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard, but you have to go through all the steps. Otherwise, you'll misdiagnose and you end up spending a lot of money. Those catalytic converters are expensive. And there's 2, no 1.
Right.
No 1.
And again, it is. And as you know, as you get better at going through the steps and more comfortable with what the steps tell you, you're able to use more high-level tests to prove you don't need to do each of the individual steps, because you get more comfortable with the higher level tests. And that's where you start to save time. It's not that we're skipping things. We're just using things to prove I don't have to test certain things.
And how do you test them? I'm sorry to interrupt. What do you use, oscilloscope or bidirectional scanner to test the? Oh, okay. So you use both. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I use both in the shop all the time. It depends on, it's like asking me, do I use a hammer or a screwdriver? I mean, they're both great tools. I don't want to use them interchangeably.
Yeah, I think I need to give me one of those to diagnose better. But with my scanner, I did it okay, and with both speed and everything. So I found out what the problem was, because you don't see the cracks. They're really, really thin. I mean, you can't see it with naked eye. You have to like do a vacuum to see if where it's leaking with water and soap, and you go through the whole pipe, and it's how I find out what it was.
Yeah.
I thought it was the catalytic converter too. It was like, oh no. Well, there it wasn't. Didn't have a lot of mileage. So
hey, I found it.
Right away, I said, no, I couldn't be the catalytic converter. So something else.
No, good job. You didn't get distracted by what it cannot be.
Yeah, I'll do it all the time. Every time I diagnose something, I go to step by step, so I don't have to replace parts that I don't need, because I did it before. Like I've been doing mechanical stuff for a long time. That I used to like think that it was a part, I go get it and replace it and never fix the problem, and I end up paying somebody to diagnose.
You and everybody else has done that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You bet. Everybody take care, be safe, have a great rest of your day.